Welcome to Derry.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Is this on? Is that on? Yeah, it is on. So, how do you feel?
Overwhelmed.
So, this is your first time here in
Yes.
Northern Ireland, and the sun is shining.
Yeah.
Do you think you brought us sunshine?
I'm told we brought the heat.
So, we'll get this started now. So, your new book, Backtalker, is about voice. It's about power and telling truth and refusing to accept injustice is normal. For people here in Northern Ireland who may not know you, and for the first time they have heard the word intersectionality, what does Backtalker means to you personally?
Well, so first I have to contextualize the book in a particular time in history, most specifically for me, in the history of how ideas that I'm associated with have traveled in the public arena. Over the last 4 or 5 years, the effort to push back against what was a global reaction to racial injustice that happened when George Floyd was murdered in Minnesota and when other African Americans were murdered, led to the most widespread resistance and demands for racial justice that the country had ever seen. The backlash to that was a backlash not only to some of the policies that came from the protests, but to some of the ideas themselves. So intersectionality was an idea that's been around for 40 years. It rarely traveled into media and to public space. But in the aftermath of George Floyd, with many people using intersectionality as a reason why and a way of thinking about why racial justice mattered to everybody, not just racialized people, prompted those who were trying to shut down the progress that was being made to actually then become censors of ideas. So intersectionality was one of those ideas that the MAGA group in American society kind of targeted. And when they came after intersectionality, I was closely associated with that because it was a word that I'd come up with. So over the course of these years, intersectionality has been framed as a divisive concept. It's been framed as a foreign import. It's been framed as a religion. It's been framed as a disease. All of these things were things that sought to defame the ideas and undermine what it could do. So at a certain point, I had to think about, well, what I was going to say about that. I could have written a treatise. I could have written a brief. I could have written a multi-chapter philosophical engagement in all of the sources of intersectionality, and there are many. But the most important thing to me was to push back against the idea that intersectionality was just a crazy idea that I thought up in an office somewhere. Rather, it is a way that I made sense of the life that I had lived as a Black girl who came of age during the civil rights movement, who became a teenager during the women's movement, and who was aware of and engaged in the deeper struggles around social justice over the course of my youth. So I wanted to write a story that showed people that, first of all, the ways that you try to make sense of your life can sometimes be the source of innovation, the source of new ideas, the source of inspiration to name some of the things that went unnamed. That was the first thing. But the second thing is, what do you learn from that story? And how do we use these ideas now? So Backtalker was initially a framework that is a way of describing a child who doesn't accept authority, a child who is unruly, a child who talks back, a child who asks questions, a child who doubts the legitimacy of the authority being put on them. In a world that we are living in now, where as citizens, many of us are being treated as that child. Listen to what I say, do what I tell you to do, accept the terms of the world that you have been born into, don't try to change things. That kind of spirit of backtalking is what we all need to contest authoritarianism. So these two things have come together, trying to tell a story about where these ideas come from, but also thinking very critically about, well, when did I start asking these questions, and how was it that these questions were talking back to the idea that, you know, if you live in a world that is gendered, you live in a world in which you are minoritized, you live in a world in which you are subject to other forms of inequality, are you going to just accept it, or are you going to talk back to it? And so Backtalker became the framework for my answer to that question.
Incredible, incredible. Yeah. And just following on that, you have described Backtalker as an invitation to talk back against the idea that the world as we know it is just world possible.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk more about that?
Mm-hmm.
What did you mean by that?
Yeah.
Especially for communities here who are trying to imagine a just society and being in Northern Ireland, a community that is just in the peace journey. Mm-hmm. What do you think that? Mm. Yeah.
Well, so much of the book tries to build up from questions that one might ask as a very young person, just trying to understand, okay, why does this make sense, right? And who set this up this way? So I'm trying to tell the story about how my consciousness was shaped by, first of all, some of the things that my parents exposed me to, some of the expectations that my parents placed on me in terms of how I engaged the world that I was born into, and then how that folded into broader ways that society was unfolding at the time that I was a young person. So the first thing that was very important in how I think is recognizing that my parents and their parents were what we in the United States called race men and women of the 20th century. And what that meant was that there was an understanding that there was a hierarchy that we were born into. And even in the time I was born, you know, during a time before legally we were completely free. So when I was born, it was not illegal to discriminate in housing. It was not illegal to discriminate in employment. A lot of states made it illegal to marry across race. So just as a formal matter during my own lifetime, we were not completely free. What was important to my parents and their parents was, number one, never to accept that just because it's legal to create inequality doesn't mean it's right to create inequality. Doesn't mean we should bow to it or acquiesce to it or accept it as normal or natural or believe that the place that we'd been consigned to in our society was defensible and legitimate, and we owed our fidelity to that system. So the earliest story, and I talk about this in the book, that my mom shared with me was integrating a public swimming pool when she was 3 years old. So I grew up hearing stories about how the land that I lived on had been shaped by these forms of illegitimate exclusion. What are we supposed to do with these stories? Well, number one, my parents told them to me not to burden me or to depress me, but to say, look, you are going to encounter dynamics in your life that aren't about you as an individual, not about you as a person. They don't reflect your moral worth or your right as a citizen of this country. They reflect a shadow of a past. that attempted to frame you as less than, that attempts to constrain you and to limit your possibilities. What we are going to do is everything possible to break down those barriers. What you are going to do is be prepared to walk through those doors when we do break down those barriers. So that was kind of hardwired, I guess, from the very beginning. And then they backed it up basically by expecting us when my brother and I, when it was time for dinner, we just sometimes had to stop playing a little early so that we would be able to meet the expectations of my parents to talk about our lives at the dinner table. So what did you see today? What did you learn today? What do you think about what you saw today? So for them, life was not something that just happens or you just acquiesce to. Life doesn't happen to you, you happen to life. So encouraging that interaction against the backdrop of knowing that we were not born into a situation that was just. Together, it meant we knew the structure was there, but we knew that our role in this world was to have something to say about it. Our role was not to accept it. Our role was to move the needle. So that orientation, I mean, look, I was 5 years old when one of the first things happened to me that I had to then understand what it was about. But slowly over the course of time, I began to draw connections between some of these experiences and those things that my parents would tell me about, or the ways my mother would show me the different places that had excluded people in the past. So when it gets to this contemporary moment, what does it mean to not acquiesce? What does it mean to challenge? First of all, that's sort of deeply rooted, but secondly, it means asking questions. Yeah. Where did this rule come from anyway? Yeah. Who benefits from it? What's missing that we need to create? If we look at circumstances and say, we can predict who is going to lead this organization and who's going to be emptying the garbage. We can predict who's going to die from maternal mortality and who is not. When you have these social conditions and they're predictable, then the next step is, all right, so what are the terms that create this? And what is our responsibility to do something to intervene? So it builds over the course of time. You're not immediately, a backtalker, but you have the context and the contours that set you up to talk back to the idea that inequality just is the way things have to be.
And that actually moves us to being, the whole day today, we've been discussing about the context of Northern Ireland as still in a peace journey after sectarian conflicts. And Derry is a city with a deep civil rights movement history. And for the Black and minoritized communities here, conversations about race or gender are always stereotyping. Mm-hmm. You can see prejudice and silence. People are very afraid sometimes of speaking back or talking back to the experiences that they have. And what does it mean to bring Backtalker here, particularly in our city?
Well, so I'm always cautious about drawing inferences from one context to another. I have learned to be very cautious about doing that, but I also have learned to say, this is the part of the elephant that I think is a global phenomenon. I can paint a picture about the piece that I've seen in my context. You can paint the part that you see, and we'll see if together our pictures actually show us something legible, something real. So of the hints that I have, or some of the things that I think may in fact be relevant to other contexts where there's a history of conflict, is that everywhere that there has been, I believe, there are questions about whether creating greater access to equality actually takes something away from people's expectation. In the United States context, as an example, our country has been broken more than once by those who would rather break the country than to share the country. It has been broken by those who believe that greater rights for one group takes rights away from them. It has been broken by those who sought to overturn the laws, the outcome of the Civil War, the creation of equal citizenship, based on the idea that to elevate one group from being marginalized and excluded and being discriminated against is unequal treatment, because it's not something that Congress would do for those who were not seen as the favored class of people. So in all of these moments, the common thread seems to be, if you take the baseline that you're born into, and let's say you're privileged in some way by that baseline, you're seen as belonging, if you take that as the point of departure, and you see a government or a company or a policy that tries to say, well, look, this baseline is basically not inclusive of everyone. There's more work we've got to do to make opportunity, to provide the kind of protections, to eliminate some of the barriers that some groups face that others don't. If you see this as preferential treatment, you are never going to be able to embrace wholeheartedly their needs. You're never going to be able to embrace what's necessary to make a more equitable society. So my lesson, and I'll have to say, it's not a lesson that comes from us acknowledging that problem. It's a lesson in the United States that comes from us repeating the same mistake over and over and over again. So one of the things that I say to folks now is that although MAGA, which is a faction in American society that says we want to make America great again, and by that they mean we want to take America back to a time before women had rights, before people of color, racialized minorities had rights, before they could vote, before they could live where they wanted to, before they had a role in deciding who the president of the United States was. We want to take us back to that moment before. I've said that that group, MAGA, is just the contemporary version of factions like that all across our history, always thinking it was better before, always thinking it was better when we had 100% of the rights rather than shared them equitably. If we're unable to interrogate those assumptions, if we're unable to say, well, hold up a minute, your assumptions are based on rationalizing and legitimizing the exclusion of entire groups of people. That is clearly not acceptable. If we're not able to say that, then it's going to be that much harder to support the kind of interventions that are necessary that pay attention to who's being left behind.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So, intersectionality, you have discovered today that is actually used everywhere. And you did mention that that is one of the messages you're going to take back to America.
Yeah.
But sometimes it is also misunderstood.
Yes.
The word in intersectionality, or reduced to a slogan.
Mm-hmm.
So I want you to tell us what gets lost when intersectionality is used as a language but not applied in law or policy and practice.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the things that gets lost is, you know, literacy. when I've seen, you know, intersectionality be misframed, I've seen it be framed as identity politics on steroids. I've seen it framed as a religion. I've seen it framed as an effort to, you know, as I said earlier, to turn white men into the new pariah, which itself is an intersectional claim, but we'll talk about that later. And all of these efforts have underread that intersectionality actually is incidentally about identity but centrally about structures. It's centrally about axes of exclusion or marginalization that are not singular, but are overlapping and interactive. So intersectionality, when people see it only as about identity formation, like, who are you? Are you a black person or are you a woman? Intersectionality says you're both. Well, kinda, but it really doesn't matter if I'm a black woman, if I am not in a situation that penalizes black people and women. Intersectionality doesn't have to be relevant all the time because we're not always in structures that make who we are a source of disadvantage. But when we are in those contexts in which employment, for example, might be distributed on a gender basis. There's some jobs that women can have and some jobs that men can have. Or at the same time, there's some jobs that racialized minorities can only compete for and other jobs that they can't. That's a structure that is both gendered and it's racialized. The point of intersectionality is that sometimes these two structures that are both problematic can sometimes overlap. And when they overlap, those who are subject to both of them because they are black and they are women, as one of many examples, are going to experience a different context. They're going to experience a different dynamic of discrimination. So intersectionality was just a prism. Sometimes I use an image of a pair of glasses or a pair of binoculars so that judges who initially didn't understand that discrimination can be compound rather than just singular. And the consequence of their not understanding it is when black women tried to sue employers that didn't hire them or didn't promote them. They hired women who were white and they hired men who were black, but didn't hire black people or women who were black. When they tried to raise a lawsuit, judges would say, well, you can't prove race discrimination because this employer actually does hire black people. And you can't prove gender discrimination because they actually do hire women. The only way you could possibly bring a case if we allowed you to put these two causes of action together to make a compound claim of discrimination. And of course, we can't do that. Because if we do that, then we're opening Pandora's box. There's no limitation whatsoever to all of the kinds of permutations that people might come up with. So we can't give you that, because that would be giving you preferential treatment. It's doing something for you that we don't do for anyone else, even though other people might not need to put two causes of action together to tell their story of discrimination. So I was just trying to figure out what kind of remedial glasses, what kind of bifocals, what kind of thick lenses I could give these judges, very smart, clever judges, who couldn't figure out what our lives were all about. So I say it's remedial. It's trying to repair their incapacity to see how these forms of discrimination come together. And an intersection was just a metaphor that I thought, all right, they get that you can have traffic that comes in multiple directions, and unless there's attention paid to when they come together, all sorts of things can happen in that intersection. They go through intersections every day on their way to work. So let me use something they understand to help them see something they don't understand. And so intersectionality is that. It's a word picture. That's all. And then it kind of, it skipped the rails, went beyond law, went beyond race and gender, went beyond the United States, went beyond, employment discrimination to other systems and other forms of inequality that are also interactive rather than singular.
So let's unpack that through the lens of discussions around racism and violence against women and girls. Because sometimes we have these discussions very separately. Is it dangerous to have them separately? Should we be having them together? What's your view on that?
So, one of my earliest articles about intersectionality grew out of my concern about how violence against women and girls in the United States, we call racialized minorities of color. Um, because there was a discourse about intimate partner violence and gender-based violence, and there was a conversation about racialized violence. They tended to be separate conversations in American culture. And for some personal reasons that I write about for the first time ever in Backtalker, I decided to actually look into what the intersectional challenges were in bringing these dialogues, these discourses together. And my very first effort to do empirical research, actually, I was in Los Angeles, and I wanted to test a proposition that was becoming a really often repeated thing in the efforts of feminists in the United States to get Congress and other policymakers to take intimate partner violence seriously, and also to take rape seriously, because, you know, until the latter part of the 20th century, domestic violence was seen as family pathology, not a part of a systematic way in which patriarchy is reinforced on people gendered as women. Sexual abuse was just seen as something not necessarily about violence. In any event, one of the things that they would constantly say is that anyone can be a victim of domestic violence. You know, it's not just, and this is where it got kind of touchy, it's not just racialized women. It's not just poor women. It's not just women on the other side of town. It's elite women. It's famous women. It's powerful families. And so that first move was basically an acknowledgement that people knew that domestic violence was a problem. It just wasn't a political problem as long as it was imagined to be those other women that, you know, of course that's what goes on over there. So the entire feminist enterprise was to say, we want you to pay attention to violence that happens against people like us, right? So I was deeply troubled by that move, you know, that beginning point that says it's important when we put white women in the middle of it, but it's not when it's any other kind of woman. So you had that problem on the gender side of the line. On the race side of the line, the problem that you had was that anti-black and anti-brown violence, particularly police violence, was often justified by saying, look, these people are so disproportionately violent, police have to go in, you know, with a far more coercive orientation because they're just violent. So that was a target of anti-racism, to challenge these ideas that violence against minoritized families is legitimate because they're just violent. So you got these two separate movements. Each of them have made moves that made it really hard to talk about violence against women of color. So I wanted to find out, well, what are these frameworks missing? I tried to get this data, and there was a coalition, basically, that came together of feminists and anti-racist advocates to not make that data available because it would confirm the stereotypes that the feminists are trying to organize against and the stereotypes against people of color. So eventually, I came to realize that that was a unique problem that women of color face. They fell between the cracks of the way that violence against women was being framed both by feminists and anti-racists. So the next step was basically to say, okay, where can we show why and how that approach not only is not a good approach, it makes women of color vulnerable. And so I went to rape crisis centers, I went to domestic violence shelters, with a goal of being able to show what you bring to the table if you look at this problem from an intersectional lens. And I'll just tell you one quick thing that I discovered. So in the United States, there was a shelter movement. It was designed by feminists to provide women with a place to escape if they were subject to violence. The assumption was that because all women experience or are under threat of violence, a universal approach to dealing with women who came into the shelter was going to be good enough. Turns out that's not true. So what I uncovered was undocumented women in the United States had high rates of violence and also lethal violence because they were undocumented. Because they were undocumented, it meant that they didn't take advantage of the existing resources for them because they thought, rightly so, it made them more vulnerable to being deported. Did the shelters take that into account? Initially, no. They thought, well, your immigrant status has nothing to do with the thing we're prepared to deal with. We're prepared to deal with the violence, but we're not prepared to deal with the context of your violence. Or immigrant women were least likely to be able to take full advantage of the intervention because it was all in English. Well, what if they didn't speak English? And some of the shelters would say, I got involved with one case of a woman who was, her husband was trying to kill her. She called the shelter to get services. The shelter wouldn't receive her because they say, if you can't speak English, you can't get the benefit of our services. Rather than saying, maybe our services aren't doing what they're supposed to do if you have to jump over an obstacle, a hurdle, in order to gain access to it. So this is what I call intersectional failure. Yes, you may be all about addressing violence against women, but if you don't take into account the differences between women that make a difference in their ability to access your resources, you are not doing the job you're supposed to do. So this was a way of showing you can't just think that because your program is about women and you're not looking at women in an intersectional lens, you are actually serving the communities that you claim to serve.
And you covered this a lot in your first work. And you also mention about black women and minoritized women can be let down by anti-racist movements that ignore that gender, but also feminist sisterhood.
Yes.
And I would just like you to unpack for us that statement, including what really happens when women are asked to join movements that really do not fully recognize them or take into account their situations.
Well, frankly, you just get torn apart. You have to go to the women's movement and fight there for inclusion in the way that, I was just talking about in the domestic violence context. And you have to also fight for gender inclusion within movements that address race or other forms of exclusion. I had an occasion one time when I was talking to a colleague of mine. We were both lawyers at the ACLU, and this was back in 2008 when the presidential, the campaign for who would get the nomination for the Democratic presidential candidacy was happening between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And some people said, is this going to be the women's hour, or is this going to be, the black folks' hour? And so people were going back and forth about, where are you going to line up? Are you going to vote for the woman, or are you going to vote for the black person? And I was talking to this friend of mine, wonderful white woman lawyer, did great work. And she said, well, it's simple. I just told my daughter when she asked which person I should vote for, she said, I told her to vote for the person that looks like you. Right. And I said, So what should I tell my daughter? It doesn't resolve the issue, right? It doesn't resolve the issue. And I never forget, she just had a look on her face that was, first of all, shock that, oh, wow, I can't believe I just said that, right? But then no answer, to the problem, partly because it was framed in such a mutually exclusive way. That's the dilemma that's consistently placed in front of racialized women when the choices and the frameworks are established as mutually exclusive. So much of intersectionality is an effort to illustrate not just the burdens on racialized women that have to constantly navigate between two separate movements or demands for equity and justice, but the consequences to all of us when these issues are set up in mutually exclusive ways. So one of the chapters in my book is also about how that history of seeing race and gender as separate and mutually exclusive led to a huge defeat for civil rights and social justice when a very, 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 very conservative Black judge, Clarence Thomas, was confirmed to the Supreme Court. I won't go into it now, but the long story is that where we have arrived now, with our democracy basically being for sale, with major laws being overturned that were designed to advance our democracy, all of those things were made possible by his fifth vote. And that vote was made possible because of intersectional failures.
We're not going to look at where we are right now in the United US, but we are going to try and look back to where you were when things were working. And I would like to mention about policy, because here in Northern Ireland, we are just at the early stages. Their first racial equality strategy was developed in 2005. And we feel like we are regressing rather than progressing. And I just wanted you to maybe give us some advice of what would you think the question that policymakers should really start considering when developing policies of inclusion and racial justice.
Okay, so you know my general caveat about giving advice. So I'll answer that question through our own recognition that more needed to be done than simply create a system of formal equality. So going back, as you suggested, I mentioned that I was a product of the 60s and 70s before institutions had opened up, before they had embraced the idea that I call them monochromatic institutions, right? Those that are not fully integrated, before that became an unacceptable condition. So as I was coming up, there was pressure that was being placed on higher education, on entire professions by young people, my brother's generation, that were saying it's not enough just to go around singing, "We shall overcome." It's not enough to say, in our hearts, we don't see race, we don't see gender. It's not enough to do all those things if your institutions still look exactly the same as they did back when you confessed that you actually saw race or gender, or back in the time where you intentionally created pathways into those institutions that were singularly accessible to one group of people and not the others. So as my generation came in, we came in after the generation that had, fought to bring down the white-only signs, fought to provide access to the ballot. We were the ones that went through the doors that had been open. But when we went through those doors, we found out that other than bringing down the white-only signs, not much had changed in these places. There was no, making room, no moving the furniture around. Nothing happened that reflected a commitment to understanding that exclusion is not just about saying, we don't like you and we don't want your people here. That's just, if you think about racial exclusion, that's just the outer piece of the onion. You got to keep peeling the different layers of exclusion that happen inside the institution. So our generation, and these were lessons that even our elders didn't understand. And there were moments of tension between us when we got into those spaces and we found that, for example, when I went to Harvard Law School, I wanted to learn how to be a civil rights racial justice attorney. I wanted to learn the abracadabra that law could do to open up these institutions and pathways to greater equity and justice. But when I got there, the dean and the faculty had acquiesced to not having these courses taught once the person who had taught them left. They were like, okay, he's gone. Sorry, learn something else. And we were saying, how can you be a modern law school after this great societal sort of revolution that was the civil rights movement, and you are not equally committed to teaching about that in the way you're committed to teaching about corporate tax? I mean, this is all important in a modern society. And what they told us was, we can't offer those courses because there's no one qualified to teach them. And we're like, so what does qualification mean in this new moment? We're in a new moment in this society, but you're using old ways of defining what merit is. You're using old ways of defining what the mission of the institution is. You are not thinking structurally, you're not thinking institutionally. The only thing you're thinking about is, we don't want to be the bad person who says, don't even bother to apply here because we don't like your people. But what you're not asking is, well, how did we go about defining who should teach here? Well, it turns out that the definition of merit that they were using was simply based on who they were. It was simply based on who used to be in that institution. So when we asked them to lay it out, they ended up describing themselves. Right? So you're qualified to teach here, first of all, if you went to this institution. Well, what about the fact that for the most part, this institution never allowed people who look like us to come there? So just off the top, the way the institution was functioning was reinforcing the exclusions of the past. And then they went on to say, were you mentored by a famous law professor? Well, those famous law professors weren't really interested in some of the issues having to do with democracy, exclusion, the history that had kept us out. So even if you were one of a few people who got into that school who wanted to study this stuff, you didn't have anybody who was going to mentor you. And then you weren't going to be able to be a clerk for Supreme Court justice, which is another qualification, because those judges weren't actually hiring people, women or people of color, to clerk for them, and so on and so forth. So we realized that you had to pay attention to the way the institution was functioning, the values that it was prioritizing, the biographies that were privileged through those values. So you don't get to exclusion only by saying, we're only going to pay attention to the times that you're mean to people or the times that you say you have to be excluded. We've got to go underneath that to what you think is just the normal, ordinary way that this institution has always functioned, and say the normal, ordinary way these institutions have always functioned actually excluded a whole heck of a lot of people. So if your commitment is to reform those institutions, to go deeper in your equity commitments, then you have to look at what ordinarily happens, not just the extraordinary moment where people declare that we don't want your kind in these places.
And those institutions are run by people within our communities.
Of
And now
course.
I want to ask you questions about community involvement when it comes to challenging racism. We can see that there's a lot of, the racism is on the rise, misogyny is on the rise, the far right narrative together is on the rise. The far right here in the north are using women as an excuse. You know, we are protecting our women and our children. And I just wonder how communities can respond to that.
Yeah.
That assertion that it is about protecting our women, protecting our children.
Well, so here's where we're at a point where this is one of the global realities. You know, protecting women has been the justification for horrific acts of violence against marginalized others everywhere. It is the justification that has been, used to rationalize misogyny both inside the community and outside the community. It is where I think the strongest argument for intersectional failure can be made, because if you are unable to deeply interrogate the misogynistic dimensions of you are our women, we control you, you are our property, then that framework is then going to be used to justify other forms of exclusion and discrimination, as in, and you people over there are a threat to our property over here. One also has to remember, at least as I hear, these justifications, this was the justification given for racial terror in the United States for generations. We are protecting our women. That's why we are lynching you. That's why we are segregating you. That's why we are limiting your access to public space, because you are a threat to our women. In reality, everybody knew that was a lie. Number one, because many of the people who were discriminated against or even lynched, the accusation wasn't even about threat to women. It was about threat to the social economic order. Some of the most famous lynchings that took place in the United States were against black business people. They were against black folks who wanted to vote. It had nothing to do with it, but because there was an awareness that across the United States, if you try to wrap your racism and white supremacy in the idea of protecting women, you will get people to buy into your violence, even if they don't buy into your broader agenda. So being able to articulate at the same time the rights that women have to autonomy, to not being owned by anybody, not being a resource that has to be protected against the other. That's a key part of pushing back against this our women thing, and also acknowledging and understanding the extent to which many of these frames are used to continue to suppress the other, irregardless of the question of the access to or violence against women. And I guess the last thing, and it probably should be the first thing, some of the folks who are the most vocal about protecting our women are the same ones who are the threat to their women.
Absolutely. It's very true. And that makes me follow up on one thing that has become trendy. And I say trendy in a loose word, because you have been attacked online, very much so. And we know that the orange man in White House has also mentioned you very many times and your work. And most of us, especially women in public life here in Northern Ireland, have all experienced misogyny and hate online in public spaces. And I just wonder, how should our allies and policymakers and even government respond to that? Is it a job of government to police social media? Is it social media that needs to regulate this? Where do you think the problem lies, and who should solve that problem for us?
That's a very good question. I haven't thought a lot about who should do something about the attacks. Part of the way that I've protected myself emotionally and spiritually is not to look at it. So the depth of the attacks and whatever the Orange Man has said, or I don't know. I'm just like, I have a distanced view, line of sight to that with respect to social media. I do have thoughts about the broader agenda and how people should respond to the effort to erase ideas and to erase history and to erase any criticism of the foundational dimensions of society as a way of undermining movements that seek to create greater forms of justice and equity. My disappointment over the last 8 years, to be honest, really hasn't been so much against the MAGA nation, because they're on brand. They're doing exactly what they said they were going to do. They want to take America back, and the way to do it is to erase what America was like back then. So you attack the history, you attack the knowledge, you attack the capacity to consistently repudiate that history. They set out with an objective. They've described the world that they want to create, and they've done what they've needed to do to make that world attractive to the people that they want to mobilize. My problem is with all of the opponents of that, the people who are horrified about going back to the past, the people who believe that it was a good thing to move forward, the people who support civil rights, but yet do not show up when the Orange Man and others attempt to censor that history, to attack the ideas, who don't want to fight about CRT or intersectionality or any of the narratives about how we must continue to focus on racial injustice and other forms in order to protect ourselves against this far-right project. You cannot win a war that you don't show up for. You cannot win. You cannot win by saying, okay, well, let's just pivot away. Let's not use those words anymore. This current White House has been purging grants and programs and other policies based on a whole list of words that they have published. And those words constitute the grammar and the subject that we need to talk about what a fair and just society looks like. In fact, words like discrimination, bias, exclusion, marginalization, women, gender, history, all of these are ideas that are on a list. So when they are saying using any of these words is suspect, using any of these words leads to improper ideology, they are telling you that the entire agenda is improper. Once they make clear what their agenda is, if you're not prepared to say, we oppose your agenda, if you're not prepared to say, we're going to defend these words, because it's the grammar that we need to create the world we're trying to create, then you're not showing up for the battle. You're allowing what we call the heckler's veto to dictate what we have access to and what we don't. So who am I talking about? I'm talking about mainstream institutions. I'm talking about the media. I'm talking about, there's in the United States, there's an organization called the College Board, and they administer tests to determine whether you're qualified to get into college. They administer tests to determine whether you can get college credit for certain classes that you might have taken in high school. There was one of the positive outcomes of the George Floyd uprising was that the College Board created a test to allow students to get credit for taking African American studies. Well, what's going to be in the test on African American studies? Well, it turned out intersectionality was one of those ideas.
We're going to talk so much about that. And I know that there's people in the audience that would like to have some questions, and we are running out of time. So I'm going to allow two people to ask questions. So who has a burning question? I would like, there's so many hands up. Okay, I'll start with you, and then I'll come back to you and to the lady up there. Okay, you want to go? Tell us your name and your question.
Hi, my name is Kiana, and my question is, lately complaints have been made against Black people who are complaining about racism, and they're being labeled as a symptom of mental illness or mental health disorder. We've seen this during drapetomania. We've seen this during the 1960s, during the protest psychosis. And this has all been used to delegitimize their voice and their lived experiences. My question is, how might someone push back against this charge through backtalking?
Okay, I'll let you answer that because it's a long
No, I
question.
want to have more.
Okay, so that's about backtalking. Okay, the second question, please.
Can you get the mic, please? No, I can't hear you.
Is there any instances in your life which you want to share when speaking back, came with a major consequence? And my second question will be standing now and looking back, what will be your advice to your younger self?
Okay, and the last question.
I'm just going to stand up for accessibility. My name is Colette, and I'm a member of Causeway Trade Union Council. It's really an honor to meet you. You speak a lot about getting the progressive people to show up. And we had a recent counter-protest where, a lot of members of the community did show up, but there were so many more who were terrified to do so, churches who wouldn't come out, and people that, within our local community who really would have swung how it was framed, how social media picked it up, and how it, the whole situation has been portrayed. Do you have any advice for those people and how we can encourage those people to show up and get their boots on the ground? Thank you.
Okay. And I'm going to invite you to join in responding to some of these questions. So I'll start with the personal ones since they're a bit easier to respond to. Sure, being a backtalker, it wouldn't be called a backtalker if there weren't consequences, right? The whole point of talking back to authority is authority often retains the power to make you pay for it. To be a backtalker, you have to conclude that it's more important for you not to heed or heal or acquiesce to what power wants you to think or believe than it is to fight back against it. So I have been expelled from school for talking back. I was in the principal's office so many times that they should have put a placard over the chair because, that was the place that I sat. But I will say that one of the conditions of being able to withstand the consequences is actually having a community. In my instance, when I was growing up, if I got in trouble, if I was sent to the principal's office, my parents would ask me, well, tell me the story about what happened. Now, if I was cutting up, like kids do cut up, there was no principle for it. I was just not doing what I was supposed to do. I would get in trouble with my parents as well, but that wasn't talking back. What they affirmed was if I talked back against something that was happening in the curriculum that framed me or our people as less than. I went to a Christian fundamentalist school in the middle of the civil rights movement, which, there's a long story about where they came from and why I was there, but one of my teachers was of the firm belief that the rapture was coming, and the proof of it was that Black people were protesting for their rights. And every day my hand was up because my brother was one of those people. Every day I was pushing back against efforts to frame Black activists as, demonic or something like that. That was talking back. My parents reinforced the rightness of my talking back. And so the consequences to me were not as great as they may ordinarily be. Now, through the rest of my life, there have been moments that I couldn't rely on someone to intervene on my behalf. I talked back to the Obama administration about a policy that I thought was deeply unfair and marginalizing to women and girls. It was not a popular position. There were some consequences to that.
What about the showing up? The question about showing up.
The question over there.
Yeah.
Okay, let me get to it. So sometimes what it means to talk back is that you are not going to be able to rely on other people, and you've got to figure out whether you're okay being the only one out there. And that's my answer to you. With the Obama situation, there were a handful of us who went to the mat to say any racial justice program that doesn't include women and girls is not a program that we can or will support. We want everybody to support us, but if they don't, that is the reality of being committed to a principle as opposed to a person, being committed to a value as opposed to simply belonging. We ended up calling ourselves the Cassandra Project because we told people this is not going to end well. And as it turned out, it didn't end well. I'm happy with my choice. I realized there were consequences. Eventually, more people came on board. But we have to realize that's almost the case with every movement. Martin Luther King and the Montgomery bus boycott, it wasn't it wasn't all the churches that supported civil rights. In history, they want to say they were all there. But at the time, it was not necessarily a universal thing. When Martin Luther King was killed, he was not very popular. He has become popular. On the question of the use of mental illness to discredit, all sorts of things will be used to discredit people for resisting inequality. As you mentioned, people who ran away from enslavement, they weren't seen as seeking freedom. They were seen as being mentally sick, right? If you don't want to acquiesce to the terms upon which you were born, we're going to diagnose you as having an illness. But what that suggest that we need to do, or at least have in the forefront of our minds, is what's the baseline from which illness is seen as the way of describing resistance. So the baseline in enslavement was, this is the place that is normal, normative, and if you depart from it, then you're either sick or you're a criminal. If you change the baseline to, freedom is everybody's birthright. Equity is everybody's birthright. Stealing yourself away from enslavement is no longer seen as theft or a disease. It's seen as doing what any human has the right and responsibility to do in order to seek and achieve liberty and justice. So what it's telling you is that there's an underlying baseline that's happening somewhere that says that the condition that you're complaining about is normal. You've got to attack the underlying assumption in order to undermine the effort to frame the resistance as mental illness.
Professor Crenshaw, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody for listening and for coming. Professor Crenshaw will be outside signing your book if you want. The book, the Backtalker, it's outside there. I hope you grab your copy. She's coming down to sign, and it is just left for me to say thank you for showing up, and please talk back.